The Grandad was an old soldier and he was careful about everything. Careful with his money, but he wasn't mean. He was careful how he spoke to people, and he wanted his granddaughter to treat everybody the same way as he did, because he wanted to be careful in this world. He remembered when he'd been in the First World War and he'd been a soldier. He knew that you had to be careful with everything, careful with what you said. But their house was right beside Colliery B, but none of them had ever worked there. And he'd sworn that none of his sons, daughters, granddaughters would ever work at the pit. And that was just the way that he wanted to keep it. He wanted to make sure that none of his children would ever do anything as dangerous as going down the pit. But when war had broken out 2 years before, his son was called up. Well, it couldn't get much more dangerous than being in a war than working down a pit. He had the choice. He could have taken a job in the pit, but no, he did not want to go down the pit because his grandfather and his father had all said that none of them would ever work in that place. Now, the granddaughter was sitting not that very far away from the fire and sitting and watching her grandfather as he was reading the Evening Chronicle. All of the news was about the war. It was 1941. Things could have gone either way. No one could tell whether it was the Germans who would win, or, according to the Evening Chronicle, there was no doubt it was always going to be the British and the Allies who would win. But the grandfather would suck at his gums and look, and he would think, perhaps it might have been better if one of my sons had worked down the pit rather than go far away and leave their daughter with me to look after them. The granddaughter was pleased that the grandfather was there. It was always great comfort. He would say always the right things. But his ration book was getting thin, and he was using up all of his food to feed this growing girl. And reading about the war took even his smile from off his face. He tried to put a brave face on it, and he would smile and say, well, let's see what we can do tonight to find something good to eat. What shall we have? Will we have a roast suckling pig? Shall we have truffles with the turkey? When what they're really going to have was a bit of scrag end that was going to be boiled until it was just about edible. As they were sitting there, chewing on the meat and pretending that it was chicken or the finest veal or ham or beef, there was a whistling sound and a great thud. The old man had fought in the First World War, and he knew the sound of a falling bomb when he heard it. He was quite surprised that there wasn't a huge crack. He was even quite surprised that there was nothing more than a rustle. He looked outside, leaving the meat to go cold. He went outside and looked. And in the darkness, he could look and he could see that at the top of the coal heap there was an unexploded bomb. He had never set fire inside of Colliery B. His father and his father before him had said that they would never work down the pit. But now it was a case of, if he knew that the bomb was there and he left the bomb to go off, then they wouldn't have a house to come back to. It was unusual for him to have to scramble over the greasy coal, but that's just what he did. His granddaughter watched him. He went right up to the top of the great coal heap, and he might have worked in other places, at the brickworks, in the nail factory, on the river. So he was strong enough to grab hold of that bomb and pull it. She was quite surprised it was nearly as long as him, but he scrambled and he pulled and he pushed at that bomb, never thinking for a moment that it might go off. He pushed it and he rolled it and he pushed it right down into the river, and it was then that the air raid warden who saw him said, "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away!" Well, they did get away, and perhaps it was the fact that the water went into the mechanism, but the bomb never went off, and you could see people looking at him. covered in coal. Nobody had ever seen him use any coal apart from to put on his fire. But for him to be covered from the top of his head, over his nose, over his clothes, and his fingers and toes all covered with coal dust, they couldn't work out what had happened. Soon, every person inside of the town knew that the old man had saved them all by dragging the bomb across the coal heap so that it wouldn't explode close to the houses. The Granddad was an old soldier, and he was always very careful, but he couldn't believe it. As he walked down the street, people were smiling at him, nodding at him, winking at him. "You're a good 'un. You're a good 'un. You. You on the coal heap." And it was then that they sniggered, because everybody knew that he would never go anywhere near the coal. One day, later, much later in the war, the girl and the grandfather, they went along to the train station. Now, the grandfather hadn't told her why they were going to that place, but they looked at the coal heap. The girl pointed, smiled, gave him a knowing wink. "Bit like you, Grandad. Your coal heap was much bigger than that, wasn't it?" "Enough of that," said the old man. "Enough of that." The train, as it came to the station, hissed and fizzed and spluttered and sent great sheets of steam up into the air. And as they turned away from the coal heap, the girl heard a voice that she hadn't heard, not since the early days of the war. She knew it was him, the father, standing there. He looked a lot older, but even he walked up to his father, her grandfather, walked up to him and said, "What's all this I hear about you working in the pits?" Because a story as good as that one, of a grandfather who dragged an unexploded bomb across a coal heap, travelled far and wide, and had been heard at the front in the war by his own son. The three of them looked at each other, and then they all burst out laughing. "Enough of that, our lad," said the old man. "Dad," said the girl, "I can't wait to tell you what happened when Grandad became a miner."